Hello everyone, and I'm going to be bringing you some of my own games that I played in Reykjavík and my thoughts on these games that I played and improvements and some general tips for you guys how you can get better at chess by looking at your own games. Please remember to like and subscribe to the video, very useful if you do. And yeah, so recently I just had the opportunity to play in my first over the board tournament in about 2 or 3 years, the Reykjavík Open, one of my favourite competitions. A fantastic place, lovely people, great chess. It was quite a tough time, to be honest, because the first round was on Tuesday and I missed the first round. I had a bye. I had my dad's funeral on the Monday, which turned into a bit of a messy affair. But I managed to get over there for round 2, which is my first game. And I'm going to bring you a round-to-round report of each game and discussing some key things which I thought were important. I'm going to use gchess.com to try to learn from my games, and I'm just going to concentrate on the most important moments. Now, my first round opponent was Alexander May, who's a very strong Icelandic junior. We say only 2177, but he had drawn with a very strong Indian Grandmaster in the first round, was clearly underrated. I had the white pieces, which is quite nice in a tournament to get started. It's a big advantage for me, I feel, having white. And I started with d4, which is my main opening move. My opponent played knight f6. I didn't do much preparation for this game. It was a 9 AM game, and I arrived about 2 AM. I needed to get some sleep, so I decided to wheel out the Trompowsky with bishop g5. And this is the last DVD I've done for GingerGM. I concentrated on this move, which I work quite a lot with alongside Richard Palliser. And I think it's a really nice, easy move to play, which avoids a lot of theory. And you get very simple positions, so it cuts down a lot of learning, and it's a nice lazy way to start the game. My opponent played one of the main moves here, d5, which I think is one of the best moves in the position. Black trying to control the centre, very solid approach, and now I've got to decide, do I give my bishop up, double his pawns or not? Now maybe knight d2 is the way that the other way you can play, but I wanted to do his pawn structure some damage, and following the theory from that Killer Tromp video course, and now my opponent took with the most solid option here and now went e3. And I remember from that course the general idea, and this is what I concentrate on, general ideas that you do in this position as white, is bishop d3, knight d2, and then queen to f3. This is important because you want to control f5, and then once you've done that you can castle queenside and put the last piece on e2 and try to pawn storm with your pawns like this. So this is the idea in the opening, and it's important to try and play bishop d3 and queen f3 because you kind of want to make it hard for your opponent to play f5 and for him to move his knight into the center like this. So you really want to control this square. Now my opponent just played a very solid move c6, so now I continue with that plan. Knight d2. My opponent now played bishop e6. And this is a move which I couldn't remember the theory of, but I remember I had some blitz games here. Okay, I played, the next move's pretty obvious, bishop d3. This is continuing the plan I mentioned. My opponent then developed his knight behind her. And here I had a long think already, because I remember I had some blitz games where I played queen to f3 in this position, which may well be okay, not a bad move, but I then got in some trouble after the move h5. And the point is, bishop g4 is quite an annoying move that can cause my queen some trouble. And if the bishop was still on c8, I wouldn't have to worry about this. So I was kind of adapting to what my opponent's playing by not moving my queen out. The point is, if you go h3, he may still be able to play bishop g4. And this is a little tactic that I've seen, in previous times when maybe I'm even losing here, because if I I can go queen g3, but if I take on g4, then this move attacks my queen, and it also attacks my rook. So this can be very bad. So I didn't want to bring my queen out too early because this h5 move kind of scared me a little bit. And I decided that, okay, well, what's the disadvantage of my opponent moving his bishop to this square? And I thought the disadvantage of him moving his bishop there is that it's going to be a target. So I continued by moving my knight with the idea in some positions of just swapping that bishop off, putting some pressure on it. But this allowed f5, and my opponent has played very confidently here. And I mentioned earlier this maneuver of black bringing his knight into e4. At the end of the game, I will have a look at some other things with G chess, but I wanted to show you my main thoughts that were important during the course of this game. It's the first game I played over the board for years. Nice little warm-up, but you know, I'm getting back into the swing of things. And here I didn't want to allow this knight move, and I now played c4. And there was a voice in my mind of my friend Grandmaster Keith Arkyle here, who did an endgame video, Arkyle's endings for GingerGM. And Keith, I remember saying that he in my ear he was saying central pawns are more important than wing pawns. And the general idea here is that after my opponent takes it, if he doesn't capture, then then when I take on d5 at some point, and if he takes back with that pawn, he's got that pawn. You know, let's just say he plays something like this and he takes with that pawn. This pawn can be very weak here because it can't be defended by another pawn. And I can start targeting that one with some moves. I can also, the other idea I was thinking here is bishop e6, not one of the main moves I thought, was that his bishop's not on c8. It's not defending b7. So I can also try to take advantage of that by bringing my queen out here. My opponent now took here, and I kept things very simple in this first round by swapping off more pieces. And my opponent now went to swap off even more pieces of knight b6. Let's just go. I went queen b3. We had another exchange of pieces, and we got this position. Now, I was actually very comfortable here in this position, even though if we put it on the computer, I'll put the computer valuation up now, so sometimes I'll turn it on. I don't want to use the computer too much when I'm analysing my games because I think it can do more harm than good, the computer analysis actually. And it's interesting to see here that the computer actually prefers black's position. I mean, I think, if anything, I still prefer white a little bit. I mean, probably equal is a fair thing, but just looking at the pawn structure here, I think it's interesting to see that, you know, my pawns have more potential. I have two more central pawns, and I can try using them at some point. My opponent's bishop is a good piece. I feel it's nice to have a bishop, but I also quite like my knight. And I think the first important moment comes after some more sensible moves. My opponent moved his queen. I castled. The green move is the computer's top move. My opponent, I'm going to turn this off now, play bishop d6, and this is the first important moment. Now, I will advise you during the course of these games to have a think about how you would play with the white pieces in what I would see are critical moments. This is so important for your development. And these games, they might not be that entertaining to a lot of you, but these games I'm hoping will help you if you're serious about improving in classical chess format. That's where the real chess is played. And in this position, really have a think now. You've developed, the opening stage is over, we're in the middle game. How would you think about going about formulating a plan here, which is very important. So I do suggest you pause here. And the way my brain was working here was, first of all, you've got to look at pawn pushes in positions like this. And again, my friend Keith Arkyle's thoughts were in my mind. And he was a massive believer in using the pawn minority to attack the pawn majority. And Keith would win a number of games and similar things by using his two pawns, by bringing them up the board to attack his opponent's three pawns and try to create weaknesses there, win one of those pawns, and then use his majority, which is on the king side, later on to win. So my idea here was to try and play b4, b5. This is my simple idea. take on c6, when if my opponent takes with the pawn, he has a target there which I can try to win. So that's one of my basic ideas. So let's say I go b4, he castles. I know I know he can take this, but let's say he doesn't. We get some position like this where I can now target that weak pawn there. And you can see this is quite a nice position for me because he's got a weakness. I can attack it, try to win it eventually. So this is my first idea, b4. But then I got a little bit worried that this might be premature because he might actually better go a5 here. And if anything now, I can't push on because he can simply take it, winning a pawn. I'm not ready. And if anything, my structure is a little bit weakened here. I don't really want to play a3 because now it feels like, let's say he castles. You know, this pawn could also be weak because I can't defend it. It might be okay. But I think I came up with a very clever idea. And my clever idea was rook a b1. Now this has, again, a particular plan in mode. And I think this is where, again, if we turn the computer on, we can see the computer still lights black. But this is where I start to take control over my less experienced opponent. This is where strength, in some respects, comes into the game. Formulating plans and going about playing them. I don't believe the computer's assessment here. I still think this idea b4, b5 with the rook coming here is going to be a little bit more pleasant for me because I have this plan. I thought my opponent could try and bring his rook around to h6 to attack, but I didn't really believe it. I wasn't sure what my opponent's plan would be here, so I got a simpler way to play. But now my opponent plays the move a5. Now, I was very happy to see this. My opponent played this automatically because I now change plans to my secondary pawn break, and a5 is actually quite a big weakness, as we're going to see. And it's funny how little pawn moves can really make your position quite a lot worse. Now b4 is going to be very hard for me to plan, but I can now go for another pawn break, and after rook to d1, I'm now threatening to play d5 and establish a very, maybe, okay, I'm not going to get the same pawn weakness as I can, but my plan now is to swap my d pawn for my c pawn and get a very nice control of the center. So this is more not a structural idea. The last one's a structural idea, but I want to get the open d file. I want to control that d file, and I want to use my knight in the center of the board. And once I get control of that file, especially the d5 square, this square here, I might start being able to attack these pawns. So let's just continue a little bit more. Now my opponent, I'll leave the computer on. The computer suggests b5. Now I would have actually been quite happy to have seen this because, and it's funny how the computer now changes its assessment quite quickly, because after queen c2, he's just weakened this pawn on c6. And you know, I expect he's okay here, but at least I've got a target to attack. Now, before playing rook to c1, I might even bring my knight to d3, where it controls c5, because the only thing I don't want him to do is you know, get rid of that weakness by moving it forwards. So my knight would be a lot better on this square where it controls that break. And I kind of like white's position here, slightly better. But anyway, let's go back to the game. My opponent simply played rook d8, and again, he played this very quickly. And his idea is this would be a blunder because he would take it, and now he played bishop takes h2 check and win my rook. But of course I'm not going to fall for that one, and I now just secure that square more, and I played knight c3 very quickly. My opponent was still blitzing, he castled, but now after d5 he sunk into a lot of deep thoughts, and when I turn the computer on, it will show you that I've kind of taken a bit of control of this position. Now my opponent played queen c7, still following Stockfish's top move, but after just simply g3, I don't want to allow this one. I might be able to take on c6, but I don't need to. I think all this position is a little bit tough for my opponent, because at some point he has got to let me take on c6, creating a weakness. I thought maybe he could play c5 at some point, but now you can see one of the problems of him making this pawn move. There's a big hole on b5. I can try coming into that. That must be a little bit better for me, this position. I've got a nice pass pawn. And this was a tricky position for my opponent. My opponent took here. And after the exchange of queens, my knight comes to d5. And you might just think this is a draw, but it's actually incredibly tricky to play for black. For example, a knight in the center of the board that cannot be kicked away by a pawn, which it can't be, there's no pawns that can move that, is nearly always stronger than the bishop. Stronger than the bishop here. So this knight is dominating the board. I also have some nice open file. I have some targets, his pawn on a5, his pawn on f5 to attack. I have no weaknesses. Excuse me, I keep switching the board. I can bring my king maybe towards the center, you know, something like this even, and I can play this position very easily. And my opponent, I have to say, played bishop d6. My threat was to check and take here. I now improve my pieces. How can I do that? Well, my knight is perfect. I want to improve my rooks, so I want to double my rooks up. And after this move, my opponent now defended, I think, what can only be said, excellently. Really, really good defense here. And again, I'd suggest you now to think that, you know, you've got to be able to defend positions as well. If you're in black shoes here, what would you play in this position? Because my plan is quite simple. I'm going to go rook d1. And in that position, I have many possibilities. Even knight to f6, pawn takes, rook takes d6 would be very nasty. But you've got to, when you're thinking about these positions, not just think of your own plans, but think about what moves can your opponent play. And here, I was thinking, what can black actually play? And I decided before my opponent played it, the move he played was the best move. So we both came to the same conclusion. And again, think, you know, in order to improve your own chess, you've got to get into your opponent's shoes. Not just think about natural moves that help your position, like moving the rook here, maybe moving the king to the center, but what can my opponent actually move here? And he hasn't got many options. And my opponent now played king h8, which is a very clever move because a lot of my ideas are based on these checks. And he wants to defend by putting his bishop on e5 and his rook on d6. And this was an excellent defensive idea my opponent played. Now, just to show you how difficult this position is for my opponent, let's say he plays something like rook to e8 here. I'll turn the computer on. I would continue simply rook to d1, and you can see that the winning advantage here is practically game over. At this level, 1.5 pawn advantage. My knight is threatening to move somewhere with a fantastic position because of this check. If he goes a6, I was even thinking here knight b6 is very strong, winning a pawn, but I've always got this knight f6 check to get a very good ending as well. He has to take it, and look at his horrible pawn structure in an ending like this. Very likely his pawns will drop here. This would be a disgusting ending to hold because, you know, one idea would just be to march my king up and take these guys. So he's got to be very, very careful. Now, the computer doesn't actually give this move. It gives something else. But I really think king h8 is a great move. But here I played a bit lazily. I moved my rook to d1. Now, I did see the right idea. And I think the right idea now, don't fall in love with your pieces. This is something very important. It's very easy to fall in love with your pieces. And here I fell in love a little bit with my knight on d5. But now he's played king h8. My knight on d5 is not actually, it's okay placed, but it's not doing anything. Don't fall in love with the visual side of things. You've got to have purpose. And now that I'm never going to do these checks, it was time to reroute this knight. Can you see a better square for this knight to move to? That put more pressure directly on my opponent's position. And what I should have played, I played rook d1. This allowed my opponent to defend. But what I should have played here would have been the very clever move, knight to b6. And I saw this idea, but I kind of fell in love and I played a little bit lazily with my knight here. And the point here, my knight is just going to come back to c4. And actually there, it's very nicely placed because I'm probably going to win that pawn. My knight can be secured on that square with a4, stopping b5. And I'm generally going to just try and take some pawns and control the position. So this would have left my opponent in a really bad state of affairs because my knight has much more purpose here because it targets directly something of my opponent's. Now I played rook to d1, and now my opponent continued defending very well. He played bishop e5, and I just moved my pawn forwards, and now I wanted to play knight here next move and do this maneuver, but he played the brilliant rook d6, and all of a sudden my position is not so advantageous here, because the issue is if I move my knight, he's going to make exchanges, and where can I move my knight? My knight doesn't have anywhere good to go. I want to put it somewhere like here, but I can't get it there. And this position was hard, and you can see now that I should have played knight e7. But even this I didn't think was very clear. So I played a4. Now this is a good structural move, because when you're playing knight versus bishop, if all the rooks come off the board, which they do, you want to have your pawns on the colour square where they can't be attacked by your opponent's bishop. So at the moment they're perfectly placed, because my opponent's bishop can never capture those pawns. But you also want to make sure your opponent's pawns are trapped on squares where they can't move, they have no flexibility. And in this case, that pawn there, when I get a knight to c4, I should be able to do it at some point, it's always going to be attacked. It's going to be quite hard to defend there. And we're now going to just fast forward a little bit. You can see my advantage has gone. My opponent plays g6, and I now well, okay, still got a bit of an advantage, but the game now develops, and I have to say, around here I realised I lost most of my advantage, and now I try to improve my structure with an idea. You always look at pawn breaks if you can't see any piece breaks. And I went h3, and the idea here is to go f4 and g4. And again, I remember seeing a game of Keith Archives where he was able to play this, which drastically improved his situation. Let's say my opponent went king g7, a logical move. Well, here I'd be able to play like f4, and let's say something like here, g4. My opponent would have to take this, because otherwise I take here. And this, even though I've got rid of my opponent's double pawns, really helps my position. And I remember, again, from this Archives ending, Keith demonstrating an endgame he had with this change, where he got a pawn to e5, and he won a very nice game there. And let's just show that on the board, how this could help. It doesn't matter, my knight's never in danger. You can get something like this. Okay, in this case, I'm winning a piece, but just this structure is very, very nice. It gains a lot of space, and it gives me ideas of even starting an attack. So this is what I was going for, even though more pawns are getting exchanged. My opponent played very well. He played h5, and around here I thought, I could be heading to a draw now. He simply stops my idea. I play f4. I bring my king towards the center, and here again, maybe I didn't play the most accurate move. Maybe I should be playing e4 here. I know I get rid of his double pawns, but that's going to have to happen in order to make progress here. Why? Because I can't really improve my pieces here. If I can move my knight to c4, that would be fantastic, but how on earth do I get my knight to c4? The only way I can see is by getting it to b6, but that's always covered. I was thinking a knight c3, but I make exchanges. He gets a little bit closer to a draw. Does that really help me? c3 is not a good square for my knight. You've got to think of the ideal square for your pieces. c4 is definitely the square, because I attack the pawn. I maybe can come here into this side. So maybe I should have actually played e4 here, because it opens up the idea of knight e3 to c4. Maybe that would have been a better way to playing it. Anyway, I went g4. And my idea was, after this exchange, I give my opponent another dilemma to solve. What should black play here, people? Pause if you need to. And again, you know, a lot of time when you're playing chess, you'll get equal positions. They're not always going to be tactical games, and you have to just try to push. This position is, of course, equal, but you've got to try to cause as many problems for your opponent as you can and see if you can solve them. And now my idea is, like before, I want to go e4, e5. And actually, again, this pawn getting here with a stable square for my knight on f6 could be very dangerous for my opponent. He has to move his rook away from that square, etc. And even though pawns are getting exchanged, this would definitely help my chances. So my opponent plays the one move I did not want him to play, f5 check. And again, he finds the best defense. I was quite frustrated at the time. Just to show this, let's say he just sits and waits. Let's say by this, I go here, and then I get my pawn here. He can't really stop this kind of thing. Now he's got to move his rook. If he tries to control this square, well, I got this knight f6 move. I've even got ideas of checkmate threats against his king, and this has certainly helped my position. My rook can come into d7. Really nice chances here. So f5 check, good move. Now going forwards is suicidal, might get mated. So I have to go back. And now after this one, king e2. And I realized here that the only way I can do anything is by exchanging all the rooks off the board, which I assume was a draw, but we went for it because I can't do anything else. I can't move a rook because there's pressure against here. He's defended brilliantly. And now, well, okay, after a couple of moves, we get a mass exchanges of pieces here. Now, of course, this should be a draw. I do think I'm very slightly better here. Why? Because my pawns, the only pawns he can really attack is this e3 pawn. That's easy to defend. I can attack this pawn if I ever get a knight to this square or this square. He can't. He can only defend it with his king. And my king can also try to come. Let's say, for example, I move my. You've got to think of winning plans in these things. Let's say I get a knight here. He has to keep his king on g7. Well, then my king can come the other way and try to win these pawns. And he can't block that by bringing his king towards the queen side. So that's one idea. Another idea is get my knight to c4. And then I attack this pawn, which will have to guard with his bishop. And then I can try to get my king through the middle. And I don't really have any weaknesses. He's just got a slight weakness on g6, slight weakness here. Okay, so we danced about a little bit. Here, knight here. Now, if he takes it, my king is going to get right into the position, so he can't do that. b6. And now I'm rerouting my knight. I'm going to try this plan of putting my knight here if I can. He stops that. I don't want to allow the exchange here because my pawn is weak. But now my king is more active. Another reason I have some better chances. King e6, and now I went check here. And it looks here like king d5, I'm making a lot of progress. But I had a long think here. We just made the time control. And after king d5, let's say bishop c5, I couldn't see any way to make progress here. His bishop just stays there. And the problem is, I can't move my knight because my e3 pawn drops. So it should just be a draw, as the computer does indicate here. So I tried another plan, and now my other plan was twofold. Number one, I wanted to try to get my king in and get my knight to c4. This is my ideal situation because I realized the best square for my knight here, and this is what you got to sometimes do, take the knight off the board, you know, literally just take it off the board and just think, if I could put it anywhere, where would I put it? And the ideal square is actually c4 for the knight. Why? Because that defends e3, my weakness, so then my king can try to come into the position. Like if I can get my king to d5, my knight to this square, that'd be brilliant. So I'm trying to maneuver my knight around here if I can and get my king in. But my opponent stops that. He ties the pawn down. I have to come back. And now I realize it's very hard. I can go my knight to c4 now, but if I do that, my king can't get into the position. So I just try knight g5 because I'm just trying to test him a little bit. Maybe I'm going to go e4. Bishop a3, he's trying to get on my pawns like this. And eventually I decide that I have to go knight d2 and get my knight to c4. And I want to get my knight to c4, king to d5. My opponent aims to swap pawns off. Now this is okay, but this I was very happy to see this because I saw that even though when you want to draw, pawn exchanges help, I saw that after the move e4, he's got some slight tactical, well, slight problems here. Now I expect here with a move like bishop b4, trying to make exchanges, it's safe. But he played the line I was hoping he played. He played f4. And then you have to keep aware for tactics in these positions. I got check, king g4. And now if I had to go king e2, it would be just a draw. My knight would have to go backwards and forwards to defend f3. But I now have e5. And he can't take my knight because I win. So he has to move his bishop. And now king e4. And I haven't checked what a computer thinks here. It's obviously still a draw. But here I was suddenly getting quite a lot of hopes I could win, because now I have a tactical threat and he's got to be very careful. Okay, so he goes king g3, and the only way I can try winning this is by going e6, and he's got to go king g4 again. And I had a long think here, and I came up with the following idea: knight e5 check, king g3, and maybe now you guys, you can have a think. How can you try to win this position? It's still a draw, but again, you've got to try to make it as difficult as you can for your opponent. And that's what chess is all about, making it as difficult as you can for your opponent. I mean, I remember, again, speaking about Keith Arkle, a lot of times he would grind out positions like this and win. And after the game, his opponent would be like, "Oh, I don't know how I could lose that. It was just a draw." And Keith kind of just say, yeah, whatever, and laugh inside, because even though the position is a draw, the computer said it's a draw, you've got to draw it, and game chess is not easy. It might be 0.00, but it's very hard to find the draw. I mean, you could say that about the initial position in chess. It's just a draw with correct play. What's the point of playing any moves? And that is, this is one of those positions where, again, we've got to make it as difficult as we can for our opponents. Now I went knight to g6 here, and this had a particular idea in mind. First of all, push the pawn and win the pawn, and after f3 I thought this was my best chance, e7. Now the first tactical point is, if he takes here, my knight just about gets back in time, because I have a check and I can come here and cover that pawn, and I'm winning. My king comes and takes these. So we now both queen, and I now thought that after this one I go check, king f2, good move. That my original thought was that I can exchange queens here, put a king on c6 and a knight on on d7, and that has good winning chances. So my first thought was, in this position, to take the queen and try to win this ending, but I then realized that his king can come to c2 and it's quite an easy draw. So for example here, if I go queen takes queen here, I want to try to get my king here and attack this pawn with my knight and just take that pawn, but I'm always a bit slow here. I mean, I can stop his king coming towards me, but then I thought he goes here. Now I rearrange my knight, he comes towards this pawn. Let's say I go here, he moves his bishop, and now the only way I can win is by attacking that pawn. But as soon as I do this, I suddenly realized his king comes to c2 and he attacks my pawn, and there's nothing I can do here, so I need two pieces attacking b6, and he draws. For example, if his king was somewhere else over here, then it should be winning, but it's not. So I suddenly again realized, okay, this should be a draw, and I thought my best chance was to go queen c3 check, and just to try and see where he puts his king. Now his next move was a major blunder. What is the best and only square for black to move to here to ensure a draw? Again, pause if you need to. And even though this position is a draw, you can go wrong in a number of ways. Well, the only draw I could see was king f2, because he's got to stop my knight from coming in with a check. My knight is badly placed. If I get it in with a check, it improves. And after king f2, as I'm sure the computer will say, there's not really any way I can win this position, and the game should be a draw. I probably have to go for that ending, but it should be a really easy save. Now my opponent played king d1, and again this was a big mistake. I'm now going to ask you here, there is a forced win all of a sudden. Can you spot the forced win? And this is just the one mistake that my opponent played in an otherwise very good game. Pause if you need to. Well, the forced win was queen a1 check, and now knight to f4, and the difference is my knight comes in with check. He has to look after his queen, and now I get an even closer with check. And here I can now exchange the queens, because I can now get this position, king d5, and this is a very simple win. And that was just the one mistake my opponent played, which made the difference between a draw and a win. And obviously here I stop him by shouldering his king in the position, and my a-pawn queens, and I win the game. So it was a very tough first game. I mean, I kept the pressure on though. I was quite happy with that game. You know, I'm not, you know, chess is a draw after all, and all you got to do is keep the pressure on your opponent. I didn't play it quite as accurately as I wanted to earlier on, but I kept fighting, and after a 2-year break, you know, reasonably happy to get that one in. Okay, well, that was a long game, so it's a longer video. I'll try to make the future videos shorter and just get to the key moments, but do like and subscribe. You know, that's my round 2 game. I'm going to try and cover the rest of my games in videos as well.